Okay, recording. Welcome to Mystery Speed Shop. Good morning. Someone recently asked me if I took any video of the work that I did to put a Prius electronic power steering into my '63 Falcon. And no, I didn't, but I did take some photographs of what I thought were achievements along the way. I didn't video it because was not really a plan. It was take the Prius stuff and keep hacking away at it until it fit. So a video of all of that would have been very messy. It's a creative process trying to figure out what to do next. So it would have been a lot of video of me just staring at the bench and drinking beer and whatever. This first image is kind of the first achievement. I wanted to reuse the steering wheel that I had in the Falcon instead of a Toyota steering wheel with a blown airbag. So I took the one-piece Falcon steering shaft and chopped it roughly where I figured the Prius motor was going to be. And I ended up having to cut out that section. I then cut off the metric spline where the Toyota steering wheel was mounted. And you can see right on the other end of that taper, once I cut that metric spline off, this is now a completely hollow shaft. So I chucked the upper Falcon shaft in the lathe, turned it down until it was a nice slip fit into that Prius shaft. The reason why I did that is because this end of this hollow Prius shaft is a female spline that slides onto the mating input shaft to the Prius motor. There's a little spring on the male input shaft that plops into just a channel that is the retaining method for this shaft and ultimately the whole thing. So yes, if you were to grab the steering wheel and pull hard enough, you could probably pop that spring out of its channel and pull this whole shaft out. Keep that in mind. You would have to pull pretty hard though. You would have to be trying to do it or just trying to be an idiot. There it is. Yeah, it slides together. The length I wasn't sure about, so without thinking, I was thinking ahead, I guess call it luck. I left this extra long to give myself that adjustability on length, and I did end up using it. I slid it way down to about here to make the weld. End result. Next thing I did was I milled flats on the lower Falcon shaft for the adapter U-joint, Borgeson adapter U-joint, 3/4 inch double flats on one end and then a metric spline on the other. Can't remember what size the metric spline was, 30 millimeter or something like that. Don't quote me, do your own research. Cutting this was pretty easy. I used a 4-flute end mill because it is steel. It cut through it pretty easily. It was a used end mill, but it was sharp enough to where it cut through it, no problem. First cut doesn't matter. Just make sure that the shaft is level to your mill table, which it was. I checked that with just a bubble level. I figured it didn't have to be super accurate, but it was accurate enough. So I made that first cut, eyeball rotated this 180 degrees, and then to make sure that the second cut was perfectly perpendicular, and I use the word perfectly pretty loosely here, I grabbed my set of feeler gauges and just slid them under both corners of the first cut, and then just kept kind of tweaking this and then increasing in size and feeler gauge until it was equally snug on both sides. Clamped the vise down, started making cuts. Worked out really well. Probably a better way to do it, or more professional way to do it, but this worked for me. Once I rotated it, I did double check the level because what you'll see in this next, well, not this next picture, but the picture after this, is I made a bonehead mistake and didn't want to backtrack. More on that in just a second. Cheap dial scribe. I checked the bore of the U-joint from flat to flat and then made sure that this was slightly undersized by about 0.02. And it fit good. It's not a sloppy fit, but it does slide on easy. There is a set screw that goes into the flat, so it tightens it up well. And with the 2 flats, you don't really have to worry about it ever slipping. You don't have to worry about using a shaft lock compound. So yeah, this is the whole assembly just kind of slid together on my makeshift bench. This is where I made the bonehead mistake. I rebuilt this box and it needed it. It had been run with no boot down here on the bottom, so stuff was getting in there and it completely destroyed that upper bearing. You could actually feel it when driving straight at a certain speed. Just the harmonics of the old tires would just make that shaft start rattling in the bearing. You could hear it, and then you speed up, slow down, it would go away, but it was pretty ridiculous. So I got a bearing kit from Melvin's and rebuilt that steering box, scraped off all the gunk, and there was a lot of gunk. Shot it with some Eastwood internal frame coating, which is a good rust preventative. Just spray paint out of a can, just squirt that on there. And then to avoid getting chips into my freshly greased steering box, I just zip tied an old shirt on there for the time being, and then grabbed whatever I had nearby to make this extended bench to level this thing. And fortunately, I was able to get it level pretty quickly. This plastic cutting board came in really handy because the steering box would just glide across it. Something to think about, which I didn't even think about. I just grabbed it. It was nearby. I grabbed that butcher block that was nearby, and that is adjustable, so just kind of adjusted it up. Only took about maybe 10 minutes in setup. You can tell I've got a mess of a garage, especially when there's a car completely blown apart in there. So 10-minute setup and being able to get back to work, that's a good day. For me anyway. Here are all the components exploded. There's the U-joint I mentioned with the set screws. You can't see the other set screw, it's 90 degrees. Metric spline. The Prius column had a sleeve that was very, very tight fit over this sleeve. This sleeve you want to keep, the other sleeve has to go. And the other sleeve is the steering column. It has the hinge on it for your tilt wheel and some other junk. So I just took an angle grinder. You can see the cut marks where I just cut the sleeve all the way up, and then that loosened its grip. I could knock it off more easily. And then this is the upper tube of the Falcon steering column before I painted it. And this is how it mounts. There's kind of a horseshoe strap that bolts to the bottom of the dashboard and a little tab that locates it there to keep it from rotating. So you need that for the turn signal stock and stuff. That slides in there, that slides in there, that slides on there. And then there is a lower sleeve that I hadn't cut to size yet, so I just didn't have it in this picture yet. Here I just threw it all on the car to see how it fit and figure out where I was going to clock the motor. You can see I just have a couple of jack stands kind of holding everything up. And I didn't want to push this down to where the spring would retain this, because without anything to pull on, see this isn't welded yet, getting that back out was not easy. So that's why this is long. It should have actually been hanging out further if I would have done my measurements better up front. But like I said, this was a lot of just creative, put it together, see where to adjust. And that's why this wouldn't have made a very good video if I were to record the whole thing. Next up, I moved on to sealing up the steering box so it wouldn't ruin the bearings again. And to do that, I cut this collar on my lathe out of just some 6061 aluminum that slides over this journal, and then I took some measurements, found this seal, which it's a leather lip seal, which I wasn't too crazy about, but since it's sealing against a journal that doesn't spin, it should be fine. I just greased it up, put it all together. Here's your part number for the seal, 50126. I could not find a seal of the right size with a better lip. And there it is together, all greased up. And then the lower Falcon sleeve is a very tight fit on these. Had to actually kind of tap them in. If I really wanted to, I could RTV the bottom to completely seal it, but you actually want this to breathe. You know, if you think about it, things get cold overnight, you start driving it, they heat up, and that air can pressurize and actually push grease out from places that it shouldn't go, and worst case, even push a seal out. So there it is together. There's the other seal. I took some, I believe it was 800 grit sandpaper, and just kind of polished up that Falcon shaft. This is a double lip rubber seal, part number 472538. Fits good. I was considering putting a set screw all the way through the sleeve, the collar I made, and then that journal to make sure everything's held in place, but I got lazy. This is bolted in, so you don't really need that located, but you have to keep in mind when you grab this thing off the bench, don't grab it here, because it will slide off. That's heavy, and that'll land on your toe. I didn't do that, but I did pick this up, and it landed on my bench, and then I put the whole thing back together and made a mental note: don't pick it up like an idiot. Threw it up in the car. It is getting a new boot to seal there. This car had some really rotten frames, so I made my own frames from 1/8 inch wall. You can see the sleeve I welded there. I welded sleeves there and there too, so when you tighten this thing in, it doesn't crush the frame rail. When I cut the rusty frame rails out, public service announcement to anybody that has a rusty car: don't fill the frame with expanding foam to try to keep the mice out. That expanding foam is flammable, and when you're sitting here cutting out the rust with a plasma torch, the whole thing turns into a torch. And if there's a rust hole down here and you've got your plasma shield on, you don't necessarily see there's a flame coming out until it's coming out up under your mask. So expanding foam, leave that in your house. Don't spray it in your car. If you've got mice, duct tape it or something. Don't expanding foam. All right, here it is put together. This is my plumb bob that I was using to tell me where the steering wheel was originally, which, as you can tell, it originally was not centered very well. So I actually improved that a bit. As far as clocking the motor, I probably could have clocked it to point this way and completely hidden it, but there's a lot of stuff up under there. So I went with this. I sat in there, moved my legs around. It didn't kick my shins, so I was okay with it. As far as mounting the controller, I'm probably just going to put it there because, hey, the wires reach right there. It's, again, I just can't find anywhere under the dash to mount it. There's this blower box that just takes up a whole lot of space. If I tried to go above that, I don't even know that I could find a space over there. If I try to put it in a glove box, I'd have to extend wires. So I have a feeling that this car is going to end up with under dash AC. It currently has a 3-gauge set right there, so that will have to move down. So it will probably get some sort of a custom center console at some point in time. So for the time being, I'm just going to tack weld one of the brackets right there to the tunnel. Once it gets a tunnel again, this has been cut out. And it'll end up being hidden in the long run anyhow. Put the steering wheel back on, looks good. Obviously, this car has been messed with a lot. Very little on it was original when I got it. And then I've gone and took what was a Frankenstein and Frankensteined it even further. So this is just a $20 steering wheel, used steering wheel I found on eBay, because it had one of those really tiny Grant rubber 4-spoke 1989 era, just get it the hell out of here steering wheels. This looks a bit more correct to the 60s in my opinion, and then I like the wood. It's a bit more organic. Eventually I think I'm going to redo the door panels, because this was like some sort of really cheap just machine turn, but it's rusty. It'll work initially, but I want to redo those, cover them with something that looks organic, maybe glue some foam on it, real thin foam, and then cover it with some repurposed burlap bags. That would look kind of neat, kind of like the Warbird burnout car, except they did a burlap appearing wrap. I would do the actual burlap. So that's kind of what I'm kicking on in my head. None of the gauges worked except for the fuel gauge, and I'm probably replacing the tank anyhow. Matter of fact, I've already ordered the tank once material shortages allow me to get the thing. So all of those gauges are gone, and it's got a bunch of just cheap gauges. They're called Bosch, but they're the whatever they're called, Actron on Amazon. Pretty cheap gauges, but if they all work, then that'll be good. So it'll be a GPS speedo tach, and then coolant gauge, and then an Actron fuel gauge, which is not compatible with the factory Falcon fuel level sender. But again, good thing I'm getting a new tank. Wiring, which is what I've been working on lately for seems like forever. I get a little bit done and then I take a 3-day break and can't remember where I left off and what goes where. But this is how you wire it. Constant 12 volts, fused, big fuse, about a 40 amp, although you could probably use a 30 amp. Ground, just chassis ground. And then ignition keyed 12 volts on this black wire that's sitting alone. That turns this controller on. The controller then uses this plug to try to communicate with the Prius main controller. I don't know if it's the engine controller or what, but obviously the Falcon doesn't have one of those. Up to, I think, 2009, this module, if it did not communicate, would time out and default to 75% power assist, which is a healthy power assist. I have tested it. I stuck a battery in the floor pan, wired it all up, powered it up, and with the engine and transmission weight in the car, I can turn it with one finger, but it's not without having to give it some input. I pushed the car in and out of the garage. Big benefit over manual steering, where you would have to take both hands, even on that pretty large steering wheel, and kind of hold the steering wheel centralized and then give it the twist. The one thing that with the steering that I did, I mounted it just through that factory mount. That's it. So, and it's no longer one shaft. There's a U-joint in there. So if you're grabbing it with one hand and pulling on it, you're applying force that also is acting like a lever on the shaft. It's not only rotational force, but it's leveraged pointing down. And you can see the whole thing kind of this flex down and then the U-joint flex up. And that mounting strap, that single mounting strap, is just the fulcrum point. So power steering will help a lot with that. I had thought about trying to rigid mount the bottom end by the U-joint, but I think it would just take so much. It would have to be a bearing and then some sort of a bearing block mount and then a bar going up to the firewall or somewhere. So I didn't do any of that. This is good enough as long as it has power steering. So that's pretty much it. Everything else was, you know, just me trying to fix old crusty stuff. So I hope this helps. Hope you enjoyed the video. I know it's pretty dry, but thanks for watching.